What if your entire life, your future, and the future of all your descendants was decided by one moment of desperation? Not on a battlefield or in a king's court, but in a muddy laneway, with a stolen loaf of bread in your hands. What if that single act didn't just get you thrown in jail, but got you thrown to the other side of the world, to a place that didn't even exist on most maps? For over 160,000 people, this wasn't a what if. It was the grim, terrifying reality that gave birth to our nation. Their story isn't one of kings and queens, but of ordinary people forced to endure the extraordinary. It's a story of hardship, of loss, and of a resilience so profound it became the bedrock of the Australian spirit. This is the story of how a continent was settled not with flags and treaties, but with chains and broken hearts. Our story begins not under the blistering Australian sun, but in the damp, grey misery of late 18th century England. Meet Thomas, a young bloke from Dorset. He wasn't a hardened criminal, he wasn't a villain. He was a farmhand, like his father before him. He knew the seasons, the feel of the soil, and the constant, gnawing ache of an empty stomach. The enclosures had carved up the common land, pushing families like his to the brink. One bitter winter, with no work and no food, Thomas made a choice. He saw a side of bacon hanging in a wealthy merchant's window. It wasn't a plan, just a desperate impulse. A few minutes of fumbling, a frantic run through the cobbled streets, and it was over. He was caught. In the courtroom, he was a ghost. The judge, in his wig and robes, looked down from a height that felt like miles away. He didn't see a starving boy, he saw a threat to property, a breakdown in social order. The merchant spoke of his loss. The constable spoke of the crime. No one spoke of the hunger. The sentence was read out, the words echoing in the cold air. Transportation beyond the seas for the term of 7 years. 7 years. It might as well have been a lifetime. Thomas had never been more than 20 miles from his village. Now, he was being sent to the end of the earth. You have to wonder, what went through his mind in that moment? Did he even understand what it meant? The place they mentioned, New South Wales, it was just a name, a phantom land whispered about in the grimy pubs and jails. But before the great, terrifying ocean, came the river. Thomas was rowed out onto the Thames, the grey water slapping against the boat, and delivered to his new home, a prison hulk. These were old, rotting warships, stripped of their masts and cannons, now serving as floating dungeons. The stench hit you from 100 yards away, a thick, gagging mix of bilge water, unwashed bodies, and disease. He was herded below deck, into a darkness packed with hundreds of other men. They were a motley collection of souls, petty thieves, Irish rebels, hardened criminals, and boys no older than Thomas himself. Here, his name was gone, he was just a number. Days bled into weeks, weeks into months. The only light came from small, barred grates. The only sound was the constant clinking of chains, the coughing, and the groans of the sick. Perhaps that was the moment that could have changed everything for him. He could have given in to despair, let the filth and the hopelessness consume him. Many did, but somewhere in that darkness, a different kind of spark ignited. He learned the rules of this new world. Who to trust, who to avoid. He learned to listen, to watch. He shared his meagre rations with a younger boy named Finn, who was terrified and alone. They didn't talk of home, it was too painful instead. They talked of the future, this impossible place they were being sent to. They clung to the faintest sliver of hope, the idea that anything, even an unknown hell, had to be better than this floating coffin. Then, the day came. They were marched from the hulk, blinking in the unfamiliar sunlight, their legs unsteady. They were loaded onto the transport ship. If the hulk was a dungeon, this was a tomb. The space between decks was barely 4 feet high. They were chained, in pairs, packed so tightly they couldn't lie down without being pressed against their neighbours. And then, the ship began to move. Down the Thames, out into the English Channel, and then south, into the vast, unforgiving Atlantic. The journey would take 8 months. 8 months in near total darkness, rocked by storms that threw them against the timbers, and baked by the oppressive heat as they crossed the equator. Scurvy began to take hold, their gums bleeding, their joints aching. Dysentery, which they called the bloody flux, swept through the decks, killing men without ceremony. Their bodies were unceremoniously wrapped in sailcloth and tossed overboard. If only he'd known what horrors were waiting for him across the vast, empty ocean. Perhaps even that tiny spark of hope would have been extinguished. Thomas survived. He and Finn looked out for each other, they shared stories, protected each other's food, and kept each other sane during the long, terrifying nights. He learned to read the ship's movements, the mood of the guards, the subtle signs of changing weather. He was no longer just a farmhand from Dorset. He was a survivor, being forged into something new by the relentless pressure of the voyage. He saw the Southern Cross for the first time, a strange and beautiful constellation in a sky that felt utterly alien. He saw flying fish and dolphins, brief moments of wonder in a world of misery. After 252 days at sea, a cry came from the lookout, "Land ahoy!" A frantic scrabbling followed as men, weak and emaciated, tried to get a glimpse through the grates. Their first sight of Australia, it wasn't the paradise some had foolishly dreamed of. It was a long, monotonous line of coastline, a smudge of dull green under a harsh, brilliant blue sky. This was Botany Bay. Governor Phillip, the man in charge of this whole mad enterprise, soon realized it wasn't suitable. The soil was sandy, the water scarce. So the fleet moved a few kilometres north, sailing into a magnificent natural harbour, which he named Sydney Cove. This was it? The final destination. As Thomas was brought up on deck, the full, staggering reality of his new world hit him. The air was thick with the scent of eucalyptus, a smell he'd never known. The noise was a chorus of strange bird calls, the screech of cockatoos, the manic laugh of the kookaburra. The trees were twisted and unfamiliar, the light sharp and unforgiving. And there, on the shore, watching them, were the first people. The Eura. They stood silent and watchful, their dark skin and lean bodies a stark contrast to the pale, sickly convicts. They carried spears and radiated an ancient connection to this place that the newcomers could never comprehend. You have to wonder what went through his mind, staring out at that strange, silent land for the first time. Was it fear, hope, or just a profound sense of dislocation, of being utterly and completely lost? The real work began. This wasn't a settlement. It was a campsite on the edge of oblivion. The convicts, weak from the journey, were put to work. They had to clear the land, fell massive, iron-hard gum trees with blunt axes, and build rudimentary huts from cabbage tree palms and clay. The English tools they'd brought were useless against the Australian hardwood. Saws broke, axes shattered, the sun beat down on them relentlessly. Rations were meagre and soon became perilously low. The colony teetered on the brink of starvation. For Thomas, who had been transported for stealing food, the irony was cruel and absolute. Here he was, at the end of the world, starving once again. Discipline was brutal. A stolen biscuit could earn you 100 lash. The triangles were set up, and the sickening thud of the cat-o' nine tails became a regular sound in the settlement. It was a tough gig, designed to break the spirit, yet it didn't always work. A strange sense of community, a we're all in this together mentality, began to grow amongst the convicts. They developed their own slang, their own way of looking at the world. They learned to be resourceful. They learned from the land, slowly and painfully. Thomas watched the Eora people, saw how they moved through the bush, how they found food. Where the English saw only barren wasteland. 7 years is a long time. Thomas served his sentence. He kept his head down, did the back-breaking work, and survived. He survived the hunger, the lashings, and the despair. One day, he was called before the governor and handed a piece of paper. He was a free man, well, an emancipist. Free, but still trapped 15,000 kilometres from home. There was no going back. England was a memory, a ghost. This strange, harsh land was now his reality. He was granted a small plot of land on the edge of the settlement, near Parramatta. The soil was stubborn, the work relentless, but it was his. He wasn't alone. He met Eleanor, an Irish girl who had been transported for stealing a bolt of cloth. She had the same haunted look in her eyes that he recognized in himself, but also a fire, a fierce determination to live. They married under a gum tree, a simple ceremony witnessed by Finn and a few other friends. Together, they worked their small plot of land. They failed more often than they succeeded. Crops withered, they battled drought and floods, but they never gave up. They built a small, sturdy hut. They had children. And their children were different. They were born here. They were born free. They knew no other home. They were the first true Australians, Currency Creek kids, with their father's quiet resilience and their mother's fighting spirit.